Periodization. The history of sexuality supposes two ruptures if one tries to center it on mechanisms of repression. The first, occurring in the course of the 17th century, was characterized by the advent of the great prohibitions, the exclusive promotion of adult marital sexuality, the imperatives of decency, the obligatory concealment of the body, the reduction to silence and mandatory reticences of language. The second, 20th century phenomenon, was really less a rupture than an inflection of the curve. This was the moment when the mechanisms of repression were seen as beginning to loosen their grip. One passed from insistent sexual taboos to a relative tolerance with regard to prenuptial or extramarital relations. The disqualification of perverts diminished. Their condemnation by the law was in part eliminated. A good many of the taboos that weighed on the sexuality of children were lifted. We must attempt to trace the chronology of these devices, the inventions, the instrumental mutations, and the renovations of previous techniques. But there is also the calendar of their utilization to consider, the chronology of their diffusion and of the effects, of subjugation and resistance, they produced. These multiple datings doubtless will not coincide with the great repressive cycle that is ordinarily situated between the 17th and the 20th centuries. 1. The chronology of the techniques themselves goes back a long way. Their point of formation must be sought in the penitential practices of medieval Christianity, or rather in the dual series constituted by the obligatory, exhaustive, and periodic confession imposed on all the faithful by the Lateran Council and by the methods of asceticism, spiritual exercise, and mysticism that evolved with special intensity from the 16th century on. First the Reformation, then Tridentine Catholicism, mark an important mutation and a schism in what might be called the traditional technology of the flesh. A division whose depth should not be underestimated, but this did not rule out a certain parallelism in the Catholic and Protestant methods of examination of conscience and pastoral direction. Procedures for analyzing concupiscence and transforming it into discourse were established in both instances. This was a rich, refined technique which began to take shape in the 16th century and went through a long series of theoretical elaborations until, at the end of the 18th century, it became fixed in express signs capable of symbolizing the mitigated strictness of Alfonso de Liguori in the one case and Wesleyan pedagogy in the other. It was during the same period at the end of the 18th century and for reasons that will have to be determined, that there emerged a completely new technology of sex, new in that for the most part it escaped the ecclesiastical institution without being truly independent of the thematics of sin. Through pedagogy, medicine, and economics, it made sex not only a secular concern but a concern of the state as well. To be more exact, sex became a matter that required the social body as a whole, and virtually all of its individuals, to place themselves under surveillance. New too for the fact that it expanded along three axes, that of pedagogy, having as its objective the specific sexuality of children, that of medicine, whose objective was the sexual physiology peculiar to women, and last, that of demography, whose objective was the spontaneous or concerted regulation of births. Thus the sin of youth, nervous disorders, and frauds against procreation, as those deadly secrets were later to be called, designate three privileged areas of this new technology. There is no question that in each of these areas, it went back to methods that had already been formed by Christianity, but of course not without modifying them. The sexuality of children was already problematized in the spiritual pedagogy of Christianity. It is interesting to note that Molitais, the first treatise on sin, was written in the 15th century by an educator and mystic named Gerson, and that the Onania collection compiled by Decker in the 18th century repeats word for word examples set forth by the Anglican pastoral. The 18th century medicine of nerves and vapors took up in turn a field of analysis that had already been delimited when the phenomena of possession fomented a grave crisis in the all too indiscreet practices of conscience direction and spiritual examination. Nervous illness is certainly not the truth of possession, but the medicine of hysteria is not unrelated to the earlier direction of obsessed women, and the campaigns apropos of the birth rate took the place of the control of conjugal relations in a different form and at another level which the Christian penance had so persistently sought to establish through its examinations. A visible continuity, therefore, but one that did not prevent a major transformation. From that time on, the technology of sex was ordered in relation to the medical institution, the exigency of normality, and instead of the question of death and everlasting punishment, the problem of life and illness. The flesh was brought down to the level of the organism. This mutation took place at the turn of the 19th century. It opened the way for many other transformations that derived from it. The first of these set apart the medicine of sex from the medicine of the body. It isolated a sexual instinct capable of presenting constitutive anomalies, acquired derivations, infirmities, or pathological processes. Heinrich Kahn's Psychopathia Sexualis, published in 1846, can be used as an indicator. These were the years that saw the correlative appearance of a medicine, and orthopedics, specific to sex, in a word, the opening up of the great medico-psychological domain of the perversions, which was destined to take over from the old moral categories of debauchery and excess. In the same period, the analysis of heredity was placing sex, sexual relations, venereal diseases, matrimonial alliances, perversions, in a position of biological responsibility with regard to the species. Not only could sex be affected by its own diseases, it could also, if it was not controlled, transmit diseases or create others that would afflict future generations. Thus it appeared to be the source of an entire capital for the species to draw from. Whence the medical but also political project for organizing a state management of marriages, births, and life expectancies, sex, and its fertility had to be administered. The medicine of perversions and the programs of eugenics were the two great innovations in the technology of sex of the second half of the 19th century. Innovations that merged together quite well, for the theory of degenerescence made it possible for them to perpetually refer back to one another. It explained how a heredity that was burdened with various maladies, it made little difference whether these were organic, functional, or psychical, ended by producing a sexual pervert. Look into the genealogy of an exhibitionist or a homosexual, you will find a hemiplegic ancestor, a tisic parent, or an uncle afflicted with senile dementia. But it went on to explain how a sexual perversion resulted in the depletion of one's line of descent rickets in the children, the sterility of future generations. The series composed of perversion heredity degenerescence formed the solid nucleus of the new technologies of sex. And let it not be imagined that this was nothing more than a medical theory which was scientifically lacking and improperly moralistic. Its application was widespread and its plantation went deep. Psychiatry, to be sure, but also jurisprudence, legal medicine, agencies of social control, the surveillance of dangerous or endangered children, all functioned for a long time on the basis of degenerescence and the heredity perversion system. An entire social practice, which took the exasperated but coherent form of a state-directed racism, furnished this technology of sex with a formidable power and far-reaching consequences. And the strange position of psychiatry at the end of it. 19th century would be hard to comprehend if one did not see the rupture it brought about in the great system of degenerescence. It resumed the project of a medical technology appropriate for dealing with the sexual instinct, but it sought to free it from its ties with heredity, and hence from eugenics and the various racisms. It is very well to look back from our vantage point and remark upon the normalizing impulse in Freud. One can go on to denounce the role played for many years by the psychoanalytic institution, but the fact remains that in the great family of technologies of sex, which goes so far back into the history of the Christian West, of all those institutions that set out in the 19th century to medicalize sex, it was the one that, up to the decade of the 40s, rigorously opposed the political and institutional effects of the perversion heredity degenerescence system. It is clear that the genealogy of all these techniques, with their mutations, their shifts, their continuities, and ruptures, does not coincide with the hypothesis of the great repressive phase that was inaugurated in the course of the classical age and began to slowly decline in the 20th. There was rather a perpetual inventiveness, a steady growth of methods and procedures, with two especially productive moments in this proliferating history, around the middle of the 16th century, the development of procedures of direction and examination of conscience, and at the beginning of the 19th century, the advent of medical technologies of sex. 2. But the foregoing is still only a dating of the techniques themselves. The history of their spread and their point of application is something else again. If one writes the history of sexuality in terms of repression, relating this repression to the utilization of labor capacity, one must suppose that sex UAL controls were the more intense and meticulous as they were directed at the poorer classes. One has to assume that they followed the path of greatest domination and the most systematic exploitation. The young adult man, possessing nothing more than his life force, had to be the primary target of a subjugation destined to shift the energy available for useless pleasure toward compulsory labor. But this does not appear to be the way things actually happened. On the contrary, the most rigorous techniques were formed and, more particularly, applied first, with the greatest intensity, in the economically privileged and politically dominant classes. The direction of consciences, self-examination, the entire long elaboration of the transgressions of the flesh, and the scrupulous detection of concupiscence were all subtle procedures that could only have been accessible to small groups of people. It is true that the penitential method of Alfonso de Liguori and the rules recommended to the Methodists by Wesley ensured that these procedures would be more widely disseminated, after a fashion, but this was at the cost of a considerable simplification. The same can be said of the family as an agency of control and a point of sexual saturation. It was in the bourgeois or aristocratic family that the sexuality of children and adolescents was first problematized, and feminine sexuality medicalized. It was the first to be alerted to the potential pathology of sex, the urgent need to keep it under close watch and to devise a rational technology of correction. It was this family that first became a locus for the psychiatrization of sex. Surrendering to fears, creating remedies, appealing for rescue by learned techniques, generating countless discourses, it was the first to commit itself to sexual erethism. The bourgeoisie began by considering that its own sex was something important, a fragile treasure, a secret that had to be discovered at all costs. It is worth remembering that the first figure to be invested by the deployment of sexuality, one of the first to be sexualized, was the idle woman. She inhabited the outer edge of the world, in which she always had to appear as a value, and of the family, where she was assigned a new destiny charged with conjugal and parental obligations. Thus there emerged the nervous woman, the woman afflicted with vapors. In this figure, the hysterization of woman found its anchorage point. As for the adolescent wasting his future substance in secret pleasures, the onanistic child who was of such concern to doctors and educators from the end of the 18th century to the end of the 19th, this was not the child of the people, the future worker who had to be taught the disciplines of the body, but rather the schoolboy, the child surrounded by domestic servants, tutors, and governesses, who was in debt. GER of compromising not so much his physical strength as his intellectual capacity, his moral fiber, and the obligation to preserve a healthy line of descent for his family and his social class. For their part, the working classes managed for a long time to escape the deployment of sexuality. Of course, they were subjected in specific ways to the deployment of alliances, the exploitation of legitimate marriage and fertile ITY, the exclusion of consanguine sexual union, prescriptions of social and local endogaming. On the other hand, it is unlikely that the Christian technology of the flesh ever had any importance for them. As for the mechanisms of sexualization, these penetrated them slowly and apparently in 3 successive stages. The first involved the problems of birth control, when it was discovered, at the end of the 18th century, that the art of fooling nature was not the exclusive privilege of city dwellers and libertines, but was known and practiced by those who, being close to nature itself, should have held it to be more repugnant than anyone else did. Next, the organization of the conventional family came to be regarded, sometime around the 1830s, as an indispensable instrument of political control and economic regulation for the subjugation of the urban proletariat. There was a great campaign for the moralization of the poorer classes. The last stage came at the end of the 19th century with the development of the juridical and medical control of perversions, for the sake of a general protection of society and the race. It can be said that this was the moment when the deployment of sexuality, elaborated in its more complex and intense forms, by and for the privileged classes, spread through the entire social body. But the forms it took were not everywhere the same, and neither were the instruments it employed. The respective roles of medical and judicial authority were not the same in both instances, nor was even the way in which medicine and sexuality functioned. These chronological reminders, whether we are concerned with the invention of techniques or the calendar of their diffusion, are of some importance. They cast much doubt on the idea of a repressive cycle, with a beginning and an end and forming a curve with its point of inflection. It appears unlikely that there was an age of sexual restriction. They also make it doubtful that the process was homogeneous at all levels of society and in all social classes. There was no unitary sexual politics. But above all, they make the meaning of the process, and its reasons for being, problematical. It seems that the deployment of sexuality was not established as a principle of limitation of the pleasures of others by what have traditionally been called the ruling classes. Rather, it appears to me that they first tried it on themselves. Was this a new avatar of that bourgeois asceticism described so many times in connection with the Reformation, the new work ethic, and the rise of capitalism? It seems in fact that what was involved was not an asceticism, in any case not a renunciation of pleasure or a disqualification of the flesh, but, on the contrary, an intensification of the body, a problematization of health and its operational terms. It was a question of techniques for maximizing life. The primary concern was not repression of the sex of the classes to be exploited, but rather the body, vigor, longevity, progeniture, and descent of the classes that ruled. This was the purpose for which the deployment of sexuality was first established, as a new distribution of pleasures, discourses, truths, and powers. It has to be seen as the self-affirmation of one class rather than the enslavement of another, a defense, a protection, a strengthening, and an exaltation that were eventually extended to others at the cost of different transformations as a means of social control and political subjugation. With this investment of its own sex by a technology of power and knowledge which it had itself invented, the bourgeoisie underscored the high political price of its body, sensations, and pleasures, its well-being and survival. Let us not isolate the restrictions, reticences, evasions, or silences which all these procedures may have manifested, in order to refer them to some constitutive taboo, psychical repression, or death instinct. What was formed was a political ordering of life, not through an enslavement of others, but through an affirmation of self. And this was far from being a matter of the class which in the 18th century became hegemonic, believing itself obliged to amputate from its body a sex that was useless, expensive, and dangerous as soon as it was no longer given over exclusively to reproduction. We can assert on the contrary that it provided itself with a body to be cared for, protected, cultivated, and preserved from the many dangers and contacts, to be isolated from others so that it would retain its differential value. And this, by equipping itself with among other resources a technology of sex. Sex is not that part of the body which the bourgeoisie was forced to disqualify or nullify in order to put those whom it dominated to work. It is that aspect of itself which troubled and preoccupied it more than any other, begged and obtained its attention, and which it cultivated with a mixture of fear, curiosity, delight, and excitement. The bourgeoisie made this element identical with its body, or at least subordinated the latter to the former by attributing to it a mysterious and undefined power. It staked its life and its death on sex by making it responsible for its future welfare. It placed its hopes for the future in sex by imagining it to have ineluctable effects on generations to come. It subordinated its soul to sex by conceiving of it as what constituted the soul's most secret and determinate part. Let us not picture the bourgeoisie symbolically castrating itself the better to refuse others the right to have a sex and make use of it as they please. This class must be seen rather as being occupied, from the mid-18th century on, with creating its own sexuality and forming a specific body based on it, a class body with its health, hygiene, descent, and race, the autosexualization of its body, the incarnation of sex in its body, the endogamia of sex and the body. There were doubtless many reasons for this. First of all, there was a transposition into different forms of the methods employed by the nobility for marking and maintaining its caste distinction, for the aristocracy had also asserted the special character of its body, but this was in the form of blood, that is, in the form of the antiquity of its ancestry and of the value of its alliances. The bourgeoisie on the contrary looked to its progeny and the health of its organism when it laid claim to a specific body. The bourgeoisie's blood was its sex. And this is more than a play on words. Many of the themes characteristic of the caste matters of the nobility reappeared in the 19th century bourgeoisie, but in the guise of biological, medical, or eugenic precepts. The concern with genealogy became a preoccupation with heredity, but included in bourgeois marriages were not only economic imperatives and rules of social homogeneity, not only the promises of inheritance, but the menaces of heredity, families. War and concealed a sort of reversed and somber escutcheon, whose defamatory quarters were the diseases or defects of the group of relatives, the grandfather's general paralysis, the mother's neurasthenia, the youngest child's phthisis, the hysterical or erotomatic aunts, the cousins with bad morals. But there was more to this concern with the sexual body than the bourgeois transposition of themes of the nobility for the purpose of self-affirmation. A different project was also involved, that of the indefinite extension of strength, vigor, health, and life. The emphasis on the body should undoubtedly be linked to the process of growth and establishment of bourgeois hegemony, not, however, because of the market value assumed by labor capacity, but because of what the cultivation of its own body could represent politically, economically, and historically for the present and the future of the bourgeoisie. Its dominance was in part dependent on that cultivation, but it was not simply a matter of economy or ideology, it was a physical matter as well. The works, published in great numbers at the end of the 18th century, on body hygiene, the art of longevity, ways of HAVing healthy children and of keeping them alive as long as possible, and methods for improving a human lineage, bear witness to the fact. They thus attest to the correlation of this concern with the body and sex to a type of racism. But the latter was very different from that manifested by the nobility and organized for basically conservative ends. It was a dynamic racism, a racism of expansion, even if it was still in a budding state, awaiting the second half of the 19th century to bear the fruits that we have tasted. May I be forgiven by those for whom the bourgeoisie signifies the elision of the body and the repression of sexuality, for whom class struggle implies the fight to eliminate that repression. The spontaneous philosophy of the bourgeoisie is perhaps not as idealistic or castrating as is commonly thought. In any event, one of its primary concerns was to provide itself with a body and a sexuality to ensure the strength, endurance, and secular proliferation of that body, through the organization of a deployment of sexuality. This process, moreover, was linked to the movement by which it asserted its distinctiveness and its hegemony. There is little question that one of the primordial forms of class consciousness is the affirmation of the body. At least, this was the case for the bourgeoisie during the 18th century. It converted the blue blood of the nobles into a sound organism and a healthy sexuality. One understands why it took such a long time and was so unwilling to acknowledge that other classes had a body and a sex, precisely those classes it was exploiting. The living conditions that were dealt to the proletariat, particularly in the first half of the 19th century, show there was anything but concern for its body and sex. It was of little importance whether those people lived or died, since their reproduction was something that took care of itself in any case. Conflicts were necessary, in particular, conflicts over urban space, cohabitation, proximity, contamination, epidemics, such as the cholera outbreak of 1832, or again, prostitution and venereal diseases. In order for the proletariat to be granted a body and a sexuality, economic emergencies had to arise, the development of heavy industry with the need for a stable and competent labor force, the obligation to regulate the population flow and apply demographic controls. Lastly, there had to be established a whole technology of control which made it possible to keep that body and sexuality, finally conceded to them, under surveillance, schooling, the politics of housing, public hygiene, institutions of relief and insurance, the general medicalization of the population, in short, an entire administrative and technical machinery made it possible to safely import the deployed men of sexuality into the exploited class. The latter no longer risked playing an assertive class role opposite the bourgeois, it would remain the instrument of the bourgeoisie's hegemony. Whence no doubt the proletariat's hesitancy to accept this deployment and its tendency to say that the sexuality was the business of the bourgeoisie and did not concern it. Some think they can denounce two symmetrical hypocrisies at the same time, the primary hypocrisy of the bourgeoisie which denies its own sexuality, and the secondary hypocrisy of the proletariat which in turn rejects its sexuality by accepting the dominant ideology. This is to misunderstand the process whereby on the contrary the bourgeoisie endowed itself, in an arrogant political affirmation, with the garrula sexuality which the proletariat long refused to accept, since it was foisted on them for the purpose of subjugation. If it is true that sexuality is a set of effects produced in bodies, behaviors, and social relations by a certain deployment deriving from a complex political technology, one has to admit that this deployment does not operate in symmetrical fashion with respect to the social classes, and consequently, that it does not produce the same effects in them. We must return, therefore, to formulations that have long been disparaged. We must say that there is a bourgeois sexuality, and that there are class sexualities. Or rather, that sexuality is originally, historically bourgeois, and that, in its successive shifts and transpositions, it induces specific class effects. A few more words are in order. As we have noted, the 19th century witnessed a generalization of the deployment of sexuality, starting from a hegemonic center. Eventually, the entire social body was provided with a sexual body, although this was accomplished in different ways and using different tools. Must we speak of the universality of sexuality, then? It is at this point that one notes the introduction of a new differentiating element. Somewhat similar to the way in which, at the end of the 18th century, the bourgeoisie set its own body and its precious sexuality. Against the valorous blood of the nobles, at the end of the 19th century it sought to redefine the specific character of its sexuality relative to that of others, subjecting it to a thorough differential review, and tracing a dividing line that would set apart and protect its body. This line was not the same as the one which found its sexuality, but rather a bar running through that sexuality. This was the taboo that constituted the difference, or at least the manner in which the taboo was applied and the rigor with which it was imposed. It was here that the theory of repression, which was gradually expanded to cover the entire deployment of sexuality, so that the latter came to be explained in terms of a generalized taboo had its point of origin. This theory is bound up historically with the spread of the deployment of sexuality. On the one hand, the theory would justify its authoritarian and constraining influence by postulating that all sexuality must be subject to the law. More precisely, that sexuality owes its very definition to the action of the law. Not only will you submit your sexuality to the law, but you will have no sexuality except by subjecting yourself to the law. But on the other hand, the theory of repression would compensate for this general spread of the deployment of sexuality by its analysis of the differential interplay of taboos according to the social classes. The discourse which at the end of the 18th century said, there is a valuable element within us that must be feared and treated with respect, we must exercise extreme care in dealing with it, lest it be the cause of countless evils, was replaced by a discourse which said, our sexuality, unlike that of others, is subjected to a regime of repression so intense as to present a constant danger. Not only is sex a formidable secret, as the directors of conscience, moralists, pedagogues, and doctors always said to former generations, not only must we search it out for the truth it conceals, but if it carries with it so many dangers, this is because whether out of scrupulousness, an overly acute sense of sin, or hypocrisy, no matter we have too long reduced it to silence. Henceforth social differentiation would be affirmed, not by the sexual quality of the body, but by the intensity of its repression. Psychoanalysis comes in at this juncture, both a theory of the essential interrelatedness of the law and desire, and a technique for relieving the effects of the taboo where its rigor makes it pathogenic. In its historical emergence, psychoanalysis cannot be dissociated from the generalization of the deployment of sexuality and the secondary mechanisms of differentiation that resulted from it. The problem of incest is still significant in this regard. On one hand, as we have seen, its prohibition was posited as an absolutely universal principle which made it possible to explain both the system of alliance and the regime of sexuality. This taboo, in one form or another, was valid therefore for every society and every individual. But in practice psychoanalysis gave itself the task of alleviating the effects of repression. For those who were in a position to resort to psychoanalysis, that this prohibition was capable of causing, it allowed individuals to express their incestuous desire in discourse. But during the same period, there was a systematic campaign being organized against the kinds of incestuous practices that existed in rural areas or in certain urban quarters inaccessible to psychiatry. An intensive administrative and judicial grid was laid out then to put an end to these practices. An entire politics for the protection of children or the placing of endangered minors under guardianship had as its partial objective their withdrawal from families that were suspected, through lack of space, dubious proximity, a history of debauchery, antisocial primitiveness, or degenerescence of practicing incest. Whereas the deployment of sexuality had been intensifying effective relations and physical proximity since the 18th century, and although there had occurred a perpetual incitement to incest in the bourgeois family, the regime of sexuality applied to the lower classes on the contrary involved the exclusion of incestuous practices or at least their displacement into another form. At a time when incest was being hunted out as a conduct, psychoanalysis was busy revealing it as a desire and alleviating for those who suffered from the desire the severity which repressed it. We must not forget that the discovery of the Oedipus complex was contemporaneous with the juridical organization of loss of parental authority. In France, this was formulated in the laws of 1889 and 1898. At the moment when Freud was uncovering the nature of Dora's desire and allowing it to be put into words, preparations were being made to undo those reprehensible proximities in other social sectors. On the one hand, the father was elevated into an object of compulsory love, but on the other hand, if he was a loved one, he was at the same time a fallen one in the eyes of the law. Psychoanalysis, as a limited therapeutic practice, thus played a differentiating role with respect to other procedures, within a deployment of sexuality that had come into general use. Those who had lost the exclusive privilege of worrying over their sexuality henceforth had the privilege of experiencing more than others the thing that prohibited it and of possessing the method which made it possible to remove the repression. The history of the deployment of sexuality, as it has evolved since the classical age, can serve as an archaeology of psychoanalysis. We have seen in fact that psychoanalysis plays several roles at once in this deployment. It is a mechanism for attaching sexuality to the system of alliance. It assumes an adversary position with respect to the theory of degenerescence. It functions as a differentiating factor in the general technology of sex. Around it the great requirement of confession that had taken form so long ago assumed the new meaning of an injunction to lift psychical repression. The task of truth was now linked to the challenging of taboos. This same development, moreover, opened up the possibility of a substantial shift in tactics, consisting in reinterpreting the deployment of sexuality in terms of a generalized repression, tying this repression to general mechanisms of domination and exploitation, and linking together the processes that make it possible to free oneself both of repression and of domination and exploitation. Thus between the two world wars there was formed, around Reich, the historico-political critique of sexual repression. The importance of this critique and its impact on reality were substantial. But the very possibility of its success was tied to the fact that it always unfolded within the deployment of sexuality, and not outside or against it. The fact that so many things were able to change in the sexual behavior of Western societies without any of the promises or political conditions predicted by right being realized is sufficient proof that this whole sexual revolution, this whole anti-repressive struggle, represented nothing more, but nothing less, and its importance is undeniable than a tactical shift and reversal in the great deployment of sexuality. But it is also apparent why one could not expect this critique to be the grid for a history of that very deployment, nor the basis for a movement to dismantle it.